Marie Antoinette, born Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna on November 2, 1755, in Vienna, Austria, was destined from birth to play a pivotal role in European history. As the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis I, she grew up amidst the grandeur, protocol and political maneuvering of the Habsburg court. Her childhood was one of privilege, yet also of strict discipline. She was educated rigorously in languages, music, etiquette and religion, all designed to prepare her for a role as a royal consort in the complex web of European alliances. From an early age, she was acutely aware that her life would not be her own, that her marriage would be a political instrument intended to secure peace between Austria and France, two great powers with a history of rivalry. At the age of 14, Maria Antonia's life changed forever when she was betrothed to Louis Auguste, the heir to the French throne. The union was not merely a marriage, it was a strategic alliance designed to cement the long-sought reconciliation between France and Austria after decades of conflict. For Marie Antoinette, this meant leaving her beloved Vienna, her family, and the familiar comforts of home to be transported to a foreign court where the customs, language, and expectations would be entirely alien. She arrived in France in 1770, and with her came the weight of immense expectation, not only to marry successfully and produce heirs, but also to embody the elegance, grace, and political diplomacy expected of a future Queen of France. Initially, the young Archduchess faced significant challenges. Louis Auguste, who would later become Louis XVI, was shy and awkward, and their early marriage was marked by tension and a lack of intimacy. Court life at Versailles was notoriously rigid, governed by strict etiquette that dictated every action, gesture, and even the smallest social interaction. Marie Antoinette had to navigate this world carefully, balancing the demands of the king, the court, and her own identity. At first she struggled to find her place, often criticized for her foreign manners, her fashion choices, and her youthful exuberance. The court of Versailles, with its complex hierarchies and intrigue, was a crucible for the young queen, and every misstep could, and often did, be magnified into scandal. Despite the challenges, Marie Antoinette gradually began to carve out her role as France's queen. She brought with her a sense of style, sophistication, and charm that captured the imagination of some, though it would also later fuel resentment among others. Her love for fashion became legendary. She adorned herself in the latest Parisian styles and was known to influence trends throughout the court. Extravagant gowns, towering hairstyles, and exquisite jewelry became her signature, cementing her image as the epitome of royal elegance. Yet, this flair for fashion and attention to appearance, though admired by many, would later be twisted into a narrative of excess and frivolity that contributed to the public's vilification of her. Beyond fashion, Marie Antoinette also displayed intelligence, wit, and a talent for social diplomacy. She hosted salons, encouraged the arts, and engaged with intellectuals, seeking to position herself not just as a queen by title, but as a cultural patron and influential figure in court politics. However, her influence was often limited by her youth, her foreign origins, and the rigid structures of the French monarchy. She had to tread carefully, navigating factions at court, balancing the interests of powerful nobles, and ensuring that her actions did not provoke the king's displeasure or the scrutiny of the public eye. Her early years at Versailles were a delicate dance of appearances, alliances, and self-preservation. Family life was another dimension of her early reign. The pressure to produce heirs was immense, and initially Marie Antoinette faced difficulty in fulfilling this expectation. For 7 years after her marriage, she and Louis XVI were unable to conceive, a situation that caused personal anguish and political concern. The lack of children fueled rumors and criticism, with courtiers and foreign observers alike questioning her suitability as queen. This period of uncertainty tested her resilience, patience, and emotional strength as she grappled with personal disappointment, while maintaining the composure expected of a monarch. Eventually, the queen gave birth to 4 children, fulfilling her dynastic duty, but the years of scrutiny had already left an indelible mark on her public image. The Queen's early reign was also marked by her initial attempts to engage with political matters, though her influence remained limited. Marie Antoinette understood that her role was not merely ceremonial. She represented France to other nations, including her native Austria. She attempted to advise the king on matters of diplomacy, though her counsel was often dismissed or misunderstood, and her Austrian heritage made her a target of suspicion. Many French citizens perceived her as an outsider, and court intrigue only magnified the perception that she was meddling in political affairs for foreign interests. This perception would later be a central theme in revolutionary propaganda, portraying her as a symbol of corruption, detachment, and betrayal. By the mid-1770s, Marie Antoinette had established herself as a fixture of the French court, known for her charm, her extravagant lifestyle, and her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Versailles. Yet even as she gained confidence and influence, the seeds of public distrust were being sown. Her youth, her foreign origins, and her love of luxury made her vulnerable to criticism, while the growing economic difficulties of France would soon cast her every indulgence in a harsher light. The stage was set for a dramatic shift in her fortunes, a shift that would see her transition from a celebrated queen of fashion and influence to a vilified figure blamed for the failures of an entire monarchy. Marie Antoinette's rise, therefore, is a story of contrasts, a journey from innocence to responsibility, from admiration to suspicion, and from youthful ambition to the heavy burden of royal expectation. Her early life at Versailles demonstrated both her resilience and her vulnerability, her ability to charm and her susceptibility to criticism, and ultimately set the stage for the turbulent years that would follow. In understanding her rise, we gain insight not only into the personal life of one of history's most famous queens, but also into the complexities of a monarchy. On the brink of revolutionary change by the latter half of the 18th century, France was a kingdom teetering on the edge of disaster. While the court at Versailles continued to radiate opulence, power, and tradition, the country itself faced mounting economic, social, and political challenges. The monarchy, long considered an unassailable institution, was under pressure from every direction. Understanding the crisis of the French monarchy requires examining the financial instability, societal inequality, and the intellectual climate that eroded the king and queen's authority, setting the stage for the revolutionary upheaval that would soon engulf the nation. At the heart of France's crisis was its dire financial situation. The government was deeply in debt, a consequence of extravagant royal spending, centuries of war, and inefficient taxation. France had invested enormous sums in supporting the American colonies during their fight for independence, a cause intended to weaken Britain, but which further drained the treasury. While this military involvement enhanced France's international prestige, it created an enormous fiscal deficit. Meanwhile, the monarchy's lavish expenditures, particularly at Versailles, symbolized a disconnection from the suffering of the general population. The palace itself, with its glittering halls, sumptuous banquets, and endless ceremonies, became an emblem of royal excess at a time when ordinary citizens faced hunger, rising taxes, and economic hardship. The tax system in France exacerbated this financial instability. The country was divided into three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. The first two estates enjoyed significant privileges, including exemption from many taxes, while the burden of taxation fell disproportionately on the third estate, the common people. Peasants, urban laborers, and the burgeoning middle class were expected to sustain the state through heavy taxation, often while enduring rising prices for bread and basic necessities. This unequal system fostered resentment toward the monarchy and the privileged elite, creating fertile ground for revolutionary sentiment. As people struggled to feed their families and maintain their livelihoods, the court at Versailles appeared increasingly out of touch with reality. Economic hardship extended beyond taxation. France experienced recurring food shortages, particularly in the 1770s and 1780s, due to poor harvests and rising grain prices. Bread, the staple of the French diet, became increasingly unaffordable for many families, leading to public unrest and anger at perceived royal indifference. The economic pain was not limited to the peasantry. Urban workers and artisans also suffered from wage stagnation and unemployment. These conditions created a sense of shared grievance across the Third Estate and intensified calls for reform. Every financial crisis, every spike in bread prices, fed a narrative that the monarchy was both incapable of managing the kingdom and indifferent to the plight of its citizens. The political structure of the monarchy compounded these problems. France was an absolute monarchy, meaning the king wielded unchecked power. In theory, Louis XVI had the authority to implement reforms, but in practice, the system was rigid, bureaucratic, and resistant to change. Attempts to reform the tax system or curb privileges of the nobility often faced fierce opposition from entrenched interests. Even well-intentioned ministers struggled to enact meaningful change, and every failure to address financial or social issues was attributed to the monarchy's incompetence or negligence. This inability to respond effectively to crisis undermined the credibility of Louis XVI and, by extension, Marie Antoinette, who increasingly became a visible symbol of royal extravagance. In addition to fiscal and political troubles, social inequality created deep divisions within French society. The rigid hierarchy of the three estates fostered resentment among the Third Estate, which included not only peasants and laborers but also the bourgeoisie, the growing middle class of merchants, lawyers, and professionals. This group was increasingly educated, economically significant, and aware of Enlightenment ideas advocating for equality, individual rights, and representative government. They resented their lack of political power and the privileges enjoyed by the clergy and nobility. Their frustrations were amplified by the visibility of royal wealth and indulgence, such as the lavish lifestyle of Marie Antoinette, which seemed disconnected from the suffering of ordinary citizens. Enlightenment ideas further destabilized the monarchy. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu challenged traditional authority and promoted ideals of reason, equality, and civic responsibility. These ideas were widely circulated in salons, pamphlets, and books, influencing not only the educated elite, but also broader segments of society. Citizens began questioning the legitimacy of an absolute monarchy and considering the possibility of government based on principles of justice and representation rather than divine right. The monarchy's failure to adapt to these new intellectual currents made it appear increasingly outdated and oppressive in the eyes of the public. The role of propaganda and public perception cannot be understated. While Marie Antoinette's Austrian heritage, youthful energy, and love of luxury initially earned admiration, in some quarters they quickly became points of attack. Satirical pamphlets and caricatures depicted her as a manipulative, extravagant, and morally corrupt queen, framing her as responsible for the nation's troubles. Although much of this was exaggeration or outright falsehood, it resonated with a populace already suffering from economic and social distress. The Queen, once admired for her elegance and charm, became a convenient scapegoat for public anger toward a monarchy. Seen as indifferent and out of touch, attempts at reform by Louis XVI, such as appointing finance ministers to curb spending and propose new taxation policies, were largely unsuccessful. Resistance from privileged classes combined with the king's indecision meant that meaningful change was slow or impossible. Each failed reform intensified dissatisfaction and highlighted the monarchy's inability to govern effectively. France, already under severe financial strain, appeared paralyzed by political inertia, leaving the population increasingly desperate for change and more receptive to revolutionary ideas. By the late 1780s, the crisis reached a breaking point. The combination of fiscal insolvency, social inequality, political stagnation, food shortages, and rising public anger created a volatile environment. The monarchy, once revered and feared, now faced widespread criticism and hostility. Marie Antoinette, as queen, was both participant and symbol in this unraveling drama. Her personal style, foreign birth, and public image were inseparable from the growing narrative that the royal family had failed the nation. Every misstep, perceived extravagance, or rumor further eroded public confidence and set the stage for revolutionary upheaval. In conclusion, the French monarchy of the 18th century was a house of contradictions. It represented centuries of tradition, splendor, and centralized authority, yet it was simultaneously incapable of addressing the real needs of its people. Financial collapse, social division, and the spread of revolutionary ideas combined to create a crisis that the monarchy could not survive. The rise of discontent and the eventual eruption of revolution were not sudden accidents, but the inevitable outcome of systemic failures. For Marie Antoinette, this context meant that her every action was scrutinized, her every luxury condemned, and her personal reputation intertwined with the fate of a monarchy already in peril. Understanding this crisis is essential to comprehending why the Queen, despite her initial charm and influence, would become a lightning rod for public outrage and ultimately face a tragic end. Marie Antoinette's life at the French court was not only shaped by her royal duties, but also by the intense scrutiny and judgment of a public eager to find fault with their queen. From the moment she arrived in France as a young Austrian archduchess, she was subjected to suspicion, gossip, and the relentless gaze of both the court and the common people. Over time, a complex web of rumors, pamphlets, and political propaganda would turn her image from that of a fashionable and charming queen into one of a morally corrupt and politically dangerous figure. Understanding the scandals that surrounded Marie Antoinette and how public perception evolved is key to understanding why she became a symbol of the monarchy's failures. Marie Antoinette's foreign origins played a significant role in shaping public opinion. She was an Austrian princess, and Austria was a historical rival of France. From the beginning, many French citizens viewed her as an outsider, someone whose loyalties might lie more with her native Habsburg family than with her adopted country. This perception was amplified by political pamphleteers who accused her of conspiring with Austria to undermine France's interests. Even mundane actions, such as corresponding with her family in Vienna, were twisted into evidence of treachery. The Queen's nationality, which might have been seen as merely a diplomatic necessity, became a source of persistent suspicion that haunted her throughout her reign. Her love of luxury and fashion further fueled criticism. Marie Antoinette became famous or infamous for her extravagant wardrobe, towering hairstyles, and lavish spending on clothing, jewelry, and accessories. She commissioned gowns adorned with ribbons, lace, and elaborate embroidery, and her hair was often styled in gravity-defying constructions that could take hours to complete. While some admired her elegance and refined taste, others viewed it as evidence of moral decay and insensitivity to the struggles of ordinary citizens. Caricatures and pamphlets exaggerated her expenditures, portraying her as a queen more interested in frivolous pleasures than in governing her people. One of the most notorious images depicted her playing cards with diamonds while the poor went hungry, a powerful, though entirely symbolic, condemnation of her perceived excess. Rumors of promiscuity and immorality also plagued Marie Antoinette, though most were baseless or highly exaggerated. Satirical pamphlets, known as libels, circulated widely and often depicted her as sexually licentious or politically manipulative. One famous accusation, the diamond necklace affair, involved a scandal in which the Queen was falsely implicated in a scheme to defraud jewelers of a lavish necklace. Although she had no part in the affair, public perception painted her as deceitful and greedy. The incident became a symbol of her supposed corruption and fueled the growing narrative that she was unfit to lead, morally compromised, and responsible for France's woes. Political intrigue at Versailles contributed to the scandals as well. The French court was rife with factions, rivalries, and power struggles. Marie Antoinette's youth, intelligence, and charm sometimes made her a target for criticism from court insiders, including those who resented her influence over the king or her attempts to navigate court politics. Every misstep, real or perceived, became fodder for gossip and rumor. The Queen's preference for informal social gatherings and private retreats, such as the Petit Trianon, a small palace on the Versailles grounds, was interpreted as a retreat from duty and a sign of indifference to the nation. What was intended as personal space became political ammunition for her detractors. The role of the press and public opinion cannot be overstated. By the late 18th century, France had a burgeoning culture of pamphleteering and satirical commentary. Writers and publishers realized that scandals sold, and Marie Antoinette became one of their favorite subjects. The Queen's private life was scrutinized endlessly, with stories of extravagance, infidelity, and political scheming dominating the public imagination. These accounts were often highly sensationalized, mixing fact with fiction, yet they shaped a collective perception of her character. Over time, she became less a person and more a symbol of royal excess, corruption, and foreign influence. The economic context magnified these perceptions. As France's financial troubles deepened, every luxury and indulgence of the Queen was magnified in the public's eyes. While Marie Antoinette may have lived within the allowances of the royal treasury, the populace viewed her wealth as obscene in contrast to their own struggles. Food shortages, high taxes, and unemployment meant that the Queen's every opulent gown, jeweled accessory, or extravagant party was seen as a moral failing, an emblem of a monarchy completely disconnected from the lives of its subjects. In the eyes of many, her personal indulgence symbolized the structural inequities that plagued France, reinforcing the belief that the monarchy was out of touch, selfish, and unworthy of respect. The psychological impact of constant criticism on Marie Antoinette was profound. Living under near constant scrutiny, with her actions misinterpreted and her character maligned, she faced immense pressure to maintain composure, dignity, and influence. She struggled to navigate this hostile environment, balancing the expectations of the court, the king, and public perception. Her attempts to act with grace and political prudence were often misread as aloofness or arrogance, further feeding the cycle of criticism. The Queen's reputation became a tool in the hands of both court rivals and revolutionary propagandists, making her a target of attacks she could rarely defend against. By the time the French Revolution began, Marie Antoinette was already a polarizing figure. For supporters of the monarchy, she remained a cultured and influential queen, a patron of the arts, and a devoted mother. But for a large portion of the population, she had become Madame Deficit, a symbol of decadence, corruption, and moral failure. Every scandal, whether real or fabricated, reinforced the perception that she was personally responsible for the nation's misfortunes. Her foreign birth, love of luxury, and attempts to exert influence made her an easy target for revolutionary anger, and her image was weaponized to galvanize public opposition to the monarchy. In conclusion, Marie Antoinette's life was shaped as much by public perception as by reality. Scandals, whether true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, cast her in a negative light, transforming her into a symbol of everything that was wrong with the French monarchy. Her personal choices, foreign heritage, and social visibility intersected with political, economic, and social pressures to create a narrative in which she was blamed for the failures of the state. Understanding these scandals is essential to comprehending why the Queen, despite her charm, intelligence, and occasional acts of benevolence, became vilified in the public imagination, an image that would haunt her until her execution by the late 1780s. France was a nation on the brink of revolution. The long-standing social, political, and economic pressures that had been building for decades erupted into a popular movement that would dismantle the monarchy and forever transform French society. Marie Antoinette, once a young and admired queen, now found herself caught in a whirlwind of political upheaval and public hostility. The revolution did not happen overnight. It was the culmination of years of dissatisfaction, the rise of radical ideas, and the failure of the monarchy to address the growing grievances of its people. The spark that ignited the revolution was financial crisis. France's debts had reached catastrophic levels, and repeated attempts at reform had failed. King Louis XVI, increasingly indecisive and overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, struggled to implement meaningful solutions. He convened the Estates General in 1789, a legislative assembly that had not met for over 175 years in a desperate attempt to address the fiscal emergency. This event, however, quickly became a platform for the broader discontent that had been simmering among the Third Estate, the common people of France, including peasants, urban workers, and the emerging bourgeoisie. They saw the meeting not merely as a fiscal negotiation, but as an opportunity to demand political representation and challenge the privileges of the clergy and nobility. At the Estates General, tensions escalated rapidly. The Third Estate, frustrated by the intransigence of the other estates, declared itself the National Assembly in June 1789, signaling a direct challenge to the authority of the king. This act of defiance represented a shift from merely petitioning the monarchy to asserting sovereignty on behalf of the people. Marie Antoinette, observing these developments from Versailles, must have recognized the growing threat to the monarchy. Yet, her position as queen offered little room for direct influence. Any involvement she attempted risked being construed as foreign manipulation or undue interference. Her Austrian heritage, which had always made her suspect in the eyes of the French public, became a liability as revolutionary fervor intensified. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, marked a decisive turning point. The fortress prison, long a symbol of royal authority and oppression, was seized by an angry crowd demanding weapons and ammunition. The event became emblematic of popular resistance to the monarchy and inspired widespread uprisings across France. For Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, the spectacle of revolution was both shocking and terrifying. The queen, who had once enjoyed the controlled luxury of Versailles, now faced the reality that her palace and her life were increasingly vulnerable. The symbolic power of the Bastille's fall signaled that the monarchy could no longer rely on fear, tradition, or ceremony to maintain authority. The people themselves were asserting power in ways that were unpredictable and uncontrollable. As the revolution unfolded, the royal family's public image deteriorated rapidly. Marie Antoinette, in particular, became a target of revolutionary propaganda. Newspapers, pamphlets, and caricatures painted her as a decadent, manipulative, and dangerous figure who symbolized the excesses of the monarchy. Her every action, her fashion, her spending, even her private correspondence was scrutinized and often misrepresented. Revolutionary leaders framed her as an enemy of the people, a queen who cared more for pleasure than for governance. The popular narrative portrayed her not merely as an individual, but as an embodiment of the corruption, inequality, and tyranny of the French court. The royal family's attempts to navigate the crisis were fraught with peril. In June 1791, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette attempted to flee Paris in what became known as the Flight to Varennes. Their goal was to reach a royalist stronghold where they could regroup and restore monarchical authority. However, the plan failed disastrously. The family was captured near Varennes and returned to Paris under guard. This event shattered any remaining trust between the monarchy and the populace. The queen, already vilified, was now seen as a traitor attempting to abandon her nation in its hour of need. Her Austrian heritage was invoked once more as proof of suspected collusion with foreign powers, deepening public suspicion and hostility. As revolutionary institutions gained power, the monarchy's authority eroded further. The National Assembly transitioned into the Legislative Assembly and later the National Convention, each step diminishing the king's and queen's political influence. Laws were enacted to limit royal power, and the Palace of Versailles, once the center of political life in France, was increasingly isolated. Marie Antoinette, accustomed to commanding nation and respect, found herself confined and constrained, stripped of many of the ceremonial privileges that had defined her status. The Queen's private and public lives were subjected to unprecedented scrutiny, with her every word and gesture interpreted through a lens of suspicion. The revolution also brought direct danger to the royal family. Radical elements, including the Jacobins and other revolutionary factions, openly discussed the removal and punishment of the king and queen. Riots and mobs frequently threatened the palace, and Marie Antoinette's security became a pressing concern. While she continued to display composure and dignity, the psychological toll of living under constant threat, surrounded by a populace increasingly hostile to her, was immense. Every rumor of conspiracy, every pamphlet accusing her of treachery, reinforced the perception that the monarchy was irredeemable, further isolating the Queen from potential allies. By 1792, the revolution had entered a more radical phase. France was at war with foreign powers, internal rebellions erupted, and revolutionary leaders became more extreme in their demands. The monarchy, once the unchallenged center of authority, was now openly targeted for abolition. Louis XVI was arrested, and the royal family was moved to the Temple prison in Paris. Marie Antoinette, who had been criticized for her extravagance and perceived indifference, now faced the harsh reality of confinement. Stripped of her former privileges, she endured the humiliation, fear, and uncertainty of captivity. The Queen's life, once defined by grandeur and influence, was now reduced to survival under constant surveillance. Throughout this period, Marie Antoinette's public image shifted dramatically. Once celebrated for her beauty, charm, and fashion sense, she was now a symbol of royal corruption, foreign influence, and the failures of monarchy. Revolutionary leaders used her image to rally support, portraying her as the embodiment of the Ancien regime's oppression. Even acts of kindness or attempts at diplomacy were reinterpreted as manipulative or insincere. The Queen's humanity was overshadowed by the symbolic weight of her position, and her reputation became inseparable from the political and social crises engulfing France. In conclusion, the revolutionary period marked a dramatic turning point in Marie Antoinette's life. The rise of popular unrest, the fall of royal authority, and the spread of radical ideas transformed the Queen from a fashionable, influential monarch into a symbol of public anger and resentment. The monarchy, long considered untouchable, was now vulnerable to the forces of history, and Marie Antoinette's personal fate became inseparable from the fate of the institution she represented. The revolution, in its early stages, set the stage for the Queen's imprisonment, trial, and eventual execution, a trajectory shaped as much by political upheaval and social change as by the narratives and perceptions that had defined her life for decades. By 1792, the monarchy in France had collapsed under the weight of revolution, and Marie Antoinette, once the queen of elegance and influence, was now a prisoner of the state. Her transition from opulence to confinement was as abrupt as it was brutal, and the psychological toll of her imprisonment was profound. The Queen's final years were marked by isolation, fear, humiliation, and the gradual erosion of her mental and emotional strength, a trajectory that would culminate in her tragic execution. Understanding Marie Antoinette's imprisonment is essential to appreciating the human cost of revolution and the ways in which public vilification and political upheaval can crush even the most resilient individuals. Following the arrest of the royal fam, in August 1792, Marie Antoinette was initially confined to the Tuileries Palace under guard. This period was chaotic and frightening, with the threat of violence ever present. The fall of the monarchy had left her without allies, surrounded by revolutionary forces that openly despised her. The Queen, who had once walked the grand halls of Versailles with dignity and authority, was now forced to live under the constant gaze of armed guards, stripped of privacy and personal freedom. Even routine activities, such as eating or meeting with family, were regulated and monitored. This abrupt loss of autonomy was deeply destabilizing, and it marked the beginning of her psychological decline. In September 1792, the royal family was moved to the Temple prison, a former medieval fortress in Paris. The Temple was a far cry from the grandeur of Versailles, cold, dark, and cramped. Marie Antoinette was separated from much of her household staff, and the routines that had once defined her life were replaced by confinement, surveillance, and fear. Her quarters were small and sparsely furnished, and the Queen was constantly aware that her captors and the revolutionary authorities viewed her with suspicion and hostility. The physical discomfort of prison life was compounded by the emotional strain of isolation from the outside world, uncertainty about the fate of her family, and the relentless public vilification that continued even within the walls of the Temple. The Queen's relations Hip with Louis XVI during imprisonment was deeply strained by circumstance. The king, increasingly indecisive and consumed by the looming threat of execution, struggled to protect his family and maintain a sense of composure. Marie Antoinette, for her part, attempted to support him while managing her own fear and despair. Yet, the prison environment exacerbated tensions, and the psychological pressure of constant surveillance, confinement, and uncertainty created a climate in which personal resilience was difficult to sustain. The Queen, who had once wielded influence through charm and diplomacy, now found herself powerless, her status reduced to that of a common prisoner under suspicion and scrutiny. The psychological impact of separation from her children was particularly devastating. Marie Antoinette had given birth to 4 children, and her maternal instincts had always been a source of comfort and purpose. During imprisonment, she was allowed limited contact with her youngest child, while her other children were placed under the care of revolutionary authorities. This enforced separation caused deep anguish, as the Queen could neither protect her children nor comfort them in their fear. Letters and messages between mother and child were monitored and often delayed, adding to her sense of helplessness. For a queen whose identity had been intertwined with family, this loss was both emotional and symbolic, representing the disintegration of everything she had once held dear. Throughout her imprisonment, Marie Antoinette was subjected to psychological warfare and public humiliation. Revolutionary authorities, seeking to assert dominance and punish the royal family, ensured that her living conditions were uncomfortable and that her dignity was constantly undermined. She was often isolated from loyal attendants, denied privacy, and subjected to rigorous questioning and intimidation. Public perception, meanwhile, continued to portray her as a manipulative, decadent, and morally corrupt figure. Every rumor, pamphlet, and caricature reinforced the Queen's sense of alienation, magnifying feelings of guilt, shame, and despair. In the absence of support or sympathy, Marie Antoinette's mental resilience gradually eroded. The Queen's health also suffered during imprisonment. The stress of confinement, combined with poor nutrition, cold conditions, and limited access to medical care, took a toll on her physical well-being. She experienced fatigue, weight loss, and signs of depression. Her once radiant appearance, a symbol of elegance and vitality, began to fade under the harsh realities of prison life. The psychological strain manifested physically, as anxiety, sleeplessness, and fear wore down her body over months of confinement. These factors further contributed to the perception that she was broken, both in spirit and in health, long before her trial or execution. Despite these hardships, Marie Antoinette displayed moments of remarkable resilience and dignity. She maintained composure in the face of intimidation, sought to comfort her children when possible, and attempted to navigate the complex political and social landscape of imprisonment. Yet, resilience alone could not shield her from the crushing weight of isolation, fear, and public vilification. The Queen's attempts to assert some measure of control over her life were constantly thwarted by the overwhelming power of revolutionary authorities, leaving her increasingly vulnerable to despair. The final months leading to her trial intensified her psychological decline. The Queen faced interrogation, threats, and public scrutiny as the revolutionary government prepared to hold her accountable for crimes both real and imagined. She endured false accusations of treason, conspiracy, and moral depravity, all of which were amplified by propaganda that painted her as the embodiment of the monarchy's corruption. The psychological toll of anticipating judgment and execution cannot be overstated. She lived in a state of constant fear, aware that her fate, and the fate of those she loved, was entirely in the hands of hostile forces. By the time of her trial in October 1793, Marie Antoinette had been confined for over a year under harsh conditions. Her spirit, once vibrant and influential, had been worn down by relentless scrutiny, separation from family, and the daily indignities of prison life. Witnesses later described her as composed yet visibly weakened, a woman whose confidence and vitality had been replaced by weariness, anxiety, and a cautious awareness of mortality. Her imprisonment had stripped away the trappings of royalty and left her confronting the stark reality of vulnerability and mortality. In conclusion, Marie Antoinette's imprisonment and psychological decline represent a tragic chapter in the history of the French Revolution. Stripped of freedom, dignity, and family, she endured conditions designed to break the spirit of a monarch. The relentless combination of isolation, fear, public vilification, and political uncertainty eroded her mental and emotional strength, leaving her vulnerable in the face of impending execution. By the time she walked to the guillotine on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was not merely a queen facing death. She was a woman whose life, status, and resilience had been systematically dismantled. The story of her imprisonment highlights both the personal cost of revolutionary upheaval and the human consequences of public and political condemnation, revealing the fragility of even the most powerful individuals when subjected to relentless adversity.